And we're live. Yep, we're live. Hi, Alex.
Hello, AJ.
Welcome to the channel. Thanks for all the viewers who have joined us. This is Alex from UK Column. You can find his links on the description. He's a well-known speaker. I've been trying to get him here for some time. So, Alex, you want to tell a bit about yourself, and we can get started.
I'm Alex Thompson. I live in the Netherlands, as people might be able to see from the windmill backdrop. I've lived here since 2009, so time is creeping up on me. I am the commissioning editor of ukcolumn.org, which means I am responsible for the written and the audio output, the podcasts, not the videos, although I do help with them as well. And before that, and concurrently with the role of commissioning editor as well, I'm I don't use the title, but effectively the Europe and intelligence correspondent, security affairs correspondent for UK Column, because I was an intelligence officer with GCHQ from 2001 to 2009, and my specialism there was the former Soviet Union.
Excellent, excellent. So let's get started then. What we'll talk about today is obviously mainly Ukraine, Russia, and well, first of all, I just wanted to ask you a few things about the UK government. What a state we're in. Who the hell is running the country? I mean, Liz is supposed to be the prime minister. It was written in the 1922 commission that no prime minister could be ousted within the first year, and yet she gets kicked out. I mean, who the hell is making these decisions or running the country? Do you have any idea?
The banks is the long and the short of it, AJ, and I'm glad you've tracked down the source and the year, because I saw your stream with the Duran, and the two Alexanders weren't sure where that source was, that a prime minister had to last a year. But do you have any more details on that?
Yeah, it's a 1922 committee. This was written by, and you will see that. Let me see if I can find the link. But Liz Truss actually had a meeting with that committee just before she quit. And
so it's the committee that represents the interests of all the Conservative members of Parliament who aren't in government,
yeah.
the backbenchers.
Yeah, and just when she was meeting the committee, I knew her time was up. And it seems to me that either they told her you have to quit, or we're going to change the rules and get rid of this line where we cannot get rid of you within the year, or have a no.
Of course, this isn't constitutional. It's not even sub-constitutional, because it's not proceedings of the government or of Parliament. It is of the governing party's members of Parliament. So it's a de facto arrangement, a custom, you could call it.
Right. So this is something they could have easily have taken out and said, look, you can either quit as with your head held high, or we just take this out and force you to quit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the 1922 committee meetings are well known for being stormy, either in positive, supportive sense, or in a negative and foul sense. And we saw some of the lobby interviews, didn't we, this week, of MPs coming out of that meeting and blowing the gasket about Liz Truss. Well, what can we say? Start with the constitutional level. What's a prime minister? It started as a term of abuse in the late 18th century, because if you were trying to be a prime minister, it was like being a prima donna. You were trying to be high and mighty above your peers. You know, the same governing structure that, for example, the Church of England has is what used to be prevalent among crown ministers, where the Archbishop of Canterbury was called primus inter pares, the first among equals.
Yep.
And that is supposed to be how ministers act, because they're on their oath to the crown. It's at His Majesty's pleasure that they have their appointment. During, we tend to use that preposition because at His Majesty's pleasure implies going away. But the idea is that ultimately the king himself is responsible for politics, and this is what is most hotly denied in the modern era by these constitutional writers of the 19th century, who say that the king's just there for show. Of course, it suits very well the cabinet office-led establishment that goes scuttling off to the banks and think tanks to find out how to govern the country, to claim that this is no longer the case, that the king is no longer on his coronation oath. And he is, even before Charles has been crowned, he's bound by the oath, because it's statutory and a treaty level arrangement from 1688. So not even Parliament can change it. That these are the
Sure.
conditions on which the Crown governs.
Right.
Yeah. So the appointment of ministers. It's worth going into this in some depth because a lot of us are inspired by looking at presidential republics, certainly the USA, to some extent France, and assume that the same is applicable in Britain. But it isn't. A prime minister isn't an elected leader. The prime minister was only elected as a member of parliament in her own constituency in Norfolk. Right? She's not the grand figure. You're supposed to be able to bear the resignation mid-term of a prime minister and have someone else carry on without a general election. This is not horribly anti-democratic as it's often claimed to be, because there's this other old-fashioned forgotten thing called a manifesto, on the basis of which the parties are supposed to govern, and that also has been trampled underfoot now.
Sure. You say there was the banks that made the decision, but from what I can gather, Liz Truss was trying to do everything to please the banks. She was trying to get rid of the bonus for the bankers. She was obviously trying to give bankers more money. She got rid of the tax bracket, and she's doing various other things to help the bankers. So I thought she was a good puppet for the bankers. Obviously, the market's gone down because of tax cuts and many other things as well. But I do not think it's Liz's fault, to be honest. I mean, we are in this position because of all of Boris, but because of all of Rishi Sunak's actions over the past, God knows how many years, reckless money printing during COVID, obviously Brexit as well, Boris's money to Ukraine and
And I think the commitments
sanctions.
to a new zero carbon economy dwarf even the COVID and the Ukrainian
Yeah, that's right.
razzmatazes, because those are mere billions each. But the climate stuff, if you look at Ian Davis, who writes often for
Yeah.
us as well as for other people, that's into the trillions, or if you believe the hypothecations, into the quadrillions.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And Britain has spent billions and billions into wind power and solar energy. But the problem with UK, these wind power generators have not been producing any energy because we've not had any wind for the past few years. We've obviously don't have much solar because England's mostly dark, so we don't get that solar like you would do in the Gobi Desert or the Sahara Desert. And all they have basically now they're going back to fracking, and they're now going back to coal as well. It's absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, I think whoever comes in, I just think it's a poison chalice, this role.
It is, AJ, because there's two sides to it. You're quite correct that Truss and her more loyalist members like Kwarteng of her cabinet were bending over backwards to implement the bankers' agenda. But the bankers want leadership. In fact, it's not too much of a shorthand description to say that it was the bankers and their think tanks who brought the idea of leadership into politics. It was regarded as a rather wet word until recent decades. You had statesmanship, diplomacy, fiduciary duty. All of these things applied to elected politicians and appointed ministers. But leadership, which I saw, and as a Christian, I've seen creeping into the church scene as an ill-defined term, has come to mean people who get to lord it to lord it over us because of superior qualities. Why did the banks do this? Notably through the Deutsche Bank-funded Common Purpose, which, as you know, is Brian Gerish's special interest, that political charity which Deutsche Bank and other unknown banks have funded very handsomely for 40 years. They bring in this idea of leadership, and particularly selected and appointed leaders or future leaders. There's the overlap with Davos again, with the WEF. They do so because they want people whom they can put in front of the plebs and lead them on, push and pull them, in the wording of Julia Middleton, the founder of Common Purpose, to go over or around the opposition, bulldozing and dirty tricks. They do that because they want people to have confidence in the future. And you alluded to it, really. It's not that the strings on the Truss puppet snapped. No, the bankers were still holding those strings over, particularly Truss and Kwarteng, not so much over Suella Braverman. But they wanted to usher in perhaps a Sunak or a Mordaunt to replace her because the other part of the agenda wasn't being fulfilled. The strings were there that puppeted, but the
Yeah.
puppet itself was sagging. The cloth in the puppet wasn't proving up to the job.
Yeah, that brings me on to my other question. Why didn't they hire Sunak in the first place? What I mean, everybody knows that Liz Truss has been failing in every single position she's been in. Her leadership qualities have been very questionable for years, and she may have, she spoke about being anti-Chinese, anti-Russian a few times, and that's probably got her some attention. But I never seen Liz Truss as anyone very impressive over the years. Why did they hire her instead of Rishi?
Look, the spotters, the people who make personal donations to parties or even to the leadership bids within parties, the class of people like that Finnish arms dealer Poju Chaim Zabludovic, who gave $10 million to David Cameron's personal bids to lead the Conservative Party some years ago. These people are looking for those who they think have a knack about them. This is to lead the plebs again. This is why Cameron, although very elitist in background, and then Johnson, although obviously not very disciplined in his attitude to the pleasures of life, were chosen because it was thought that their raffishness and their Etonian and Oxonian breeding, that they could give a good pseudo-classical speech, would be enough to get a large swathe of Middle Britain along with them and on the world stage as well, to persuade the Americans and the Europeans and the global South that Britain was still an act worth partnering with and worth copying. With that in mind, there will have been a selection, a Bilderberg-style selection, although Bilderberg is more continental European. That kind of selection, what do we call it, vision casting meeting or candidate sifting meeting will have gone on to see which of the Tory likelies should be appointed before the next leadership bid. The same thing happens with the appointment of US presidents, as you know, selected, not elected. And they will have said, let's have, I'm sorry to offend anyone, but I'm going to put myself in their frame of mind. Let us have this poorly spoken, rather thick looking woman, because that will tick the so-called feminist box and tick the woman of the people box more than this very spiffing, superior high caste Indian man who, even as a teenager, and you've seen the clip of him, made no bones about it, that all of his milieu was superior people. We can't have that, they thought. That will cause this unease and maybe a revolt. But Truss turned out, unfortunately, if you look a bit thick and badly spoken, the risk is that you turn out to be thick. So that couldn't persist any longer.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still seeing Rishi being absolutely humiliated. I mean, now that Liz Truss has gone, the most common sense approach would be to hire, Rishi Sunak as soon as possible. Yet he's been kept in the background. They bring Boris in. Boris was in the middle of his vacation. They bring him in, and they're still messing around. I mean, it seems to me there's a lot of people in the backbenches who still do not want Rishi, and they're still playing around with different options, and they want to have
some of it will be. I mean, I don't like using the word racism; it's been weaponized, but some of it will be unease at having an Indian.
Yep.
That's not to be discounted.
Yeah,
but more of it will be questions as to how loyal he is to international finance.
Yeah, I mean, look, I work in the government, and obviously I hear people talking in the canteen. I hear people talking in the corridors, especially over the last few weeks. Rishi's name came up a few times, and people don't understand the British government. There's still a lot of people who still feel that Britain is a superpower. They've come from the age of imperialism. They've come from the age of colonialism. There's a lot of old people around.
That's one of the reasons why Truss was chosen. Sorry to interrupt, but I'll say this while it's in my mind. Truss was what's the modern phrase for an act? Was a Thatcher cosplay girl, right?
Yeah.
So people of my age and a bit older, who at that age, not yet being retired, can have no illusions about Britain being a military world power or an economic power. They still think Britain is the soft power, and that the BBC, the NHS, the Church of England are the paragons of how to run people body, mind and soul around the world. And so Truss to people of my age and a bit older in that Westminster Whitehall bubble will have seemed like the next Thatcher wannabe.
Mm.
Yeah, and Sunak, well, you go on and say what you're going to say, but it would jar with my kind of generation within that government scene, because they would think this is an outsider and an uncomfortable reminder that we don't have that power.
That's right. I mean, we've all seen the clips of Rishi Sunak where he's young and he's talking about he doesn't have any middle class friends, and obviously he's
Working
been
class, he said, yes.
yeah,
None
working
of them are
class
working
friends.
class, yes.
Yeah, no working class friends. So
Mm.
so he's as much Indian as Lenny Henry is Indian. I mean, it seems like he's been studying in all the private schools. He's been rubbing shoulders with the elites and stuff.
Mm-hmm. The
Yeah,
same
I think
applies to Priti Patel, another high
yeah,
caste
that's
Indian
right.
who has been co-opted into secular Zionism very,
Yeah,
very fervently as well.
of
So,
course, of course.
they're very able people, highly numerate. They have their own prejudices. I have to say, frankly, that they're some of the most racially prejudiced people as a group you ever come across, high caste
Yeah.
Indians. You'll know that, or anyone living in Greater London will know that, or wherever else they've settled. But they keep their noses clean, and they work very hard, and they try very hard not to offend the law or moral sentiment. Right, so there are question marks over how some of them make their money, but this is part of the package.
That's right. I think also another reason Rish has not been bought in, because everyone knows he's a billionaire. His wife has got links to Russia and China. Infosys has got offices all over Russia and China still. They haven't closed them down. And and if it does come on board and people are having a real crisis with the cost of living, people are losing their homes, people can't afford to eat, people can't afford to keep warm, and then you have Rishi who's not having any of these problems. He's living his good life, staying in his swimming pool, costing £17,000 a month. I think that's another issue as well. I don't think it's just so much the race. I think it's just the class. Most people, while most people in England and Britain are struggling, here he is having the time of his life. And I think that those are the questions that were raised when he was Chancellor as well. I think this is one of the reasons they had to get rid of him, because he, while the rest of the world, well, UK was struggling, here he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't know what was going on in the average home, and he was in his own bubble. And I think that's another major problem. I think is not just his race, but also the fact that he's so far away from an average citizen.
And there is, you mentioned the geopolitical alignment of the Sunak financial enterprises there, and that they haven't forsworn Russia and China. Now, that's true of India as a civilizational level as well. They are in the BRICS. They are the I in BRICS.
Yeah.
And they had very warm relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, largely because China and particularly Pakistan, two neighbors about whom the Indians are very worried in the long term, had alliances with the Americans and the British. So that's there in the background. Now, it hasn't been openly acknowledged that it is due to the Russia-Ukraine war, but there is now a visa complication for British citizens wanting to go to India. They have to wait several days and get a paper visa from an Indian consulate. They are not, most European, Western European nations' citizens can get an e-visa quickly and easily, but not the British. So it's a total reversal of Commonwealth membership, really, the aims thereof.
Right. I've read somewhere that also there was a trade deal which Liz had signed with India, and it wasn't something. It was still in discussions, and India had pulled out of it recently as well. So things are not
That's a
going well.
long-term thing with Britain, obviously, with Indian immigration, including a lot of capital owned by Indians in Britain. That's been something that particularly the Conservative Party has been interested in for a long time. And during the early 2010s David Cameron administration, you had great big lobbying efforts, including a big swanky flight by Cameron and various secretaries of state to India to persuade them to sign up to various British deals. And again, part of this was to persuade the Indians to pay a huge amount of money to Vodafone, if I remember correctly. And a less
Yep.
publicized part of the same agenda was to tell the Indians to start implementing common purpose leadership training, which, what you might think, what's the relevance of that, or what does Cameron or the Conservative Party get out of it? No, it's the bankers that get an interest out of that, because that would ensure that in that vast intellectual ferment, which is India, the next generation of high up officials would have a loyalty to Western economic and financial thinking.
That's right. And a couple of things that did happen as soon as the list came into power. I think India's GDP became higher than Great Britain for the first time.
Yeah.
And also, there is a clip which has gone viral online where Liz Truss went to India and he was speaking to Jay Shankar, and he absolutely embarrassed her.
Yeah.
And that clip has got almost like
I can't
billion
remember
views.
whether Truss was in this clip, but there was a very well-known pronouncement of Jaishankar just a month or 6 weeks ago, where he said, nobody should ask us whose side we're on. We're on our own
Yeah,
side.
that's the
We're our own
one.
civilization. And very
Yeah,
close to
yeah.
that, the South African foreign minister told Americans, I think to their faces, at a Pan-African diplomatic meeting, that it was time for Uncle Sam to get out of Africa, though she was a little more diplomatic than that in her wording.
That's right. That's right. And I think that clip of Jay Shankar shouting down on Liz Truss, and now Liz Truss is the manager. I mean, prime minister, and it feels like the tables have turned.
Yeah.
The Indians are looking at us as a laughing stock, and I think
As well
and
they
now,
might.
yeah, and I guess it's not acceptable to a lot of people. But Liz Truss going doing her foreign policy, she has been so unimpressive. Even on the first day when she came onto power, her first phone call was to Zelensky. She completely broke tradition.
Yeah.
Every other prime minister, the first phone call would be to the United States. She
Mm-hmm.
completely broke tradition. She called Zelensky as a first phone call, and Biden was pretty much annoyed. He was quite insulted, to be honest.
He's a
Americans
very
were not.
anti-British character anyway, as we know.
Yeah, and he was not happy at all, and I think that burnt a lot of bridges. But the fact that she called Ukraine first, it just shows that
Mm.
there was maybe someone behind the scenes talking to her, telling her, "Look, Boris did this with Ukraine. I want you to carry on with the same position. I want you
Wouldn't
to
have come out
keep."
of her own head, no.
Yeah,
She,
exactly. And the fact that she called Ukraine first, it shows that somebody pushed her towards that, asked her to keep that same level of
yeah.
commitment to Ukraine.
It's because
And
the Ukrainian struggle, a bit like the struggle of various partisans and Sandinistas and Contras in the Cold War era, although the Contras were the right-wing ones, so not directly equivalent, but the struggle of the oppressed Marxist movements around the third world, that became a rallying call for the armchair Marxists in London, didn't it, in the Cold War? And that, with a different political stripe, is now what's going on. That it's not Ukraine the territory or Zelensky the man. It's the idea of those oppressed by tyranny, by the forces of nationalism, or to quote Tony Blair, the forces of conservatism. Right, that's the kind of cartoon, the Punch and Judy version of what's going on. And the idea of Ukraine and the noble struggle transcends Zelensky, the olive t-shirted man. So you have to call him first to give obeisance to the great idea. And as I covered in a recent appearance with the Corona Ausschuss with Viviana Fischer, I said I showed them on screen an article written in Die Zeit by one of Ukraine's leading contemporary philosophers, and the version of the history being sold to the German bourgeois reader in Die Zeit is: you have to support our struggle, armed struggle, to use the overtones of Sinn Féin, because this allows you to be happy about yourselves. This will allow you to be members of that nation called Europe. And you Germans don't want anything else, because that would make you Nazis, wouldn't it? So don't be proud of yourselves. Don't be proud of even your European Union anymore, but be proud of what you're doing with the Ukrainians, so that you have a right to exist.
so let me ask you something, Alex. Why is Britain getting involved with Ukraine? I mean, after Brexit, Britain had a really good opportunity to set their own mark in the world, start building up relations with the rest of the world. But since Brexit, what we have is Britain alienating countries like China with all of their ridiculous statements, kicking out
Mm,
Chinese investments like Huawei,
hmm.
and many other companies are invested in the nuclear sector and also the chip sector. I'm talking about Nexperia as well. Then they have completely alienated, obviously, Europe because of Brexit. They have completely alienated Russia. They have completely alienated countries like India. India thinks we're a laughing stock. They've completely alienated Africa because of the colonial past. And who else is left? And United States have said that they're not going to do free trade with us. So it seems like we have been, instead of making a brand new start after Brexit, we have just been making enemies around the world. It would have been easier just to stay neutral in this
Yeah.
conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
But
What's your
a
thoughts?
neutral Britain is the last thing that the deep state wants, and it has more than one wing, right? For short, you can say the Sedwill and the Dearlove wings, the Sedwillites and the Dearlovists. So the two big daddy spooks of the last generation, although they're shuffling off the stage, certainly Sedwill to some extent. But Sedwill's persuasion represents Britain dominating the world in a kind of mid-20th century Huxleyan mold through being involved in all the mind control and international projects that are going, all the international law bodies, and therefore hugging the EU and China no matter how dictatorial they get. The Dear Love wing it regards itself as a noble and more jingoistic underdog, rising up against the formerly dominant Sedwillites. And it's been behind the anyone but Trump and the fake dossier and all of that stuff, and a large part of the Ukraine war and the banging the war drums, because it regards its bloc as a word which was until very recently was only used among a few cultural philosophers, the Anglosphere. This is now a mainstream word in broadsheets. The Five Eyes plus their appendages, including the most Atlanticist European countries like the Netherlands, where I'm talking to you from, that would be the Anglosphere. That thinking is what the Dear Love Brigade want, but it's a rearguard action against Sedwillism, and neither of these parties suggests, because it sounds dishonourable to the British because of their imperial past, the true sense of neutrality. Very successful economies, including militarily powerful countries like Switzerland, have endorsed equality, neutrality, though they have really reneged on it recently.
Yeah,
Sweden, until very recently, another example.
yeah, and
Austria,
Finland as well.
countries with very well managed domestic economies, military self-sufficiency to scare even the Russians off, and to keep the Americans out. And this has just gone by the board. And Britain could have been the leader of that pack. Ireland has very nobly done that through most of its post-1921 history. That was very much Eamon de Valera's model. It wasn't Brits out and leave us alone, although there were overtones of that in the Second World War when he was responding to Churchill's taunts as to why they weren't officially involved in the war effort, and called the Second World War the emergency rather than the war. But Ireland did have this attitude of, well, we have our cultural and economic cards to play, particularly in the English-speaking world, but there's no need for us to get entangled. I mean, the United States itself was founded with that idea, in the best sense of the word, neutrality, protecting its own industry and ultimately being able to export very good goods, services, and ideas, but without being any power blocks. But that would never do. So, when I went on an offsite with young intelligence officers of all three agencies down at the fort on the south coast, the most telling thing that was said to me by a chap who was trying to become a mentor of mine and bring me up the greasy pole was, Britain's trump card, he said, is that we are the only country that's in all the international bodies that matter. It's unthinkable that we should be in none of them, that we should stand on our own 2 feet and be a city on a hill, as the Puritans wanted America and before that Britain to be.
Right, but it seems to me that this has happened very recently, because there was a time when China was invited in, and there was it was like the golden era of relations between China and UK. And also London is obviously called Londongrad because you had a huge influx of oligarchs coming in and spending money, buying properties, money laundering obviously as well. A huge amount of Russians. I mean, there's Russian businesses everywhere, nightclubs opening up owned by Russians. So there was obviously a very good business agreement between Russians and the
Oh,
Chinese, and
more, more
suddenly,
directly than that, the Russian, mostly anti-Putin oligarchs who settled in London, if not nearly exclusively anti-Putin oligarchs, soon worked out that the thing to do in the British political wheeze was to become the personal donors to the party and leadership campaigns of the mainstream parties and top politicians.
that's right. And then I'm hearing stories about all of these oligarchs, whether you're a friend of Putin or not, are being kicked out of Britain because of the Ukraine war, and
Mm.
there's a huge amount of Russophobia.
In other
And
words, the dear lovists, for short, I'm not suggesting these two men personally are pulling all the strings, but they are the granddaddies of the ideas. The dear lovists, if you like, have, as you saw with Brexit itself, and I spoke to Seb Abekasis about this on Not the BBC, his very good YouTube channel. Um, uh, Everything from 2016 onwards indicates that the dear lovists were not as dead as people thought, or not as powerless as people thought. They're still the underdog, but they are able to do things that would have been unthinkable in the Labour-governed Eurocratic 2000s, the decade when I was in the intelligence services. It was just unthinkable that we would ever do such things as boot out foreign lugubrious gentlemen with cash.
that's right. And I mean, all of these oligarchs, they're not even friends of Putin, and they have their yachts being taken away from them, properties being taken away. And I have a lot of friends who are Russians as well, and they've said they're moving back to Russia, and
Mm-hmm.
they also tell me stories about how a lot of their Russian friends are taking their money out of Britain, taking them to Dubai, for example, taking them to China,
You'd be a fool
and
to keep any money in Britain with a Russian citizenship or surname at this point. At
that's
some point,
right.
it's going to be
And if you look,
confiscated from you. It's obvious.
that's right. And if you look at the figures, I mean, we're talking about trillions of pounds. There's a lot of Russian money invested, and all of that's been taken out of the British economy. I mean, you look at Roman Abramovich, for example. He's been forced to sell his club. I mean, what the hell has he got to do with the Ukraine war? He has been, he has been investing in UK. He has been investing in Fulham, all the local areas for years. He has been
But
doing a
this is
really good
the
service.
trust premiership in a nutshell. They dimly got the idea, or dim people strongly got the idea, rightly got the idea that the thing to do was to bash the Russians at all costs, and this entailed, capital flight and a plummeting pound exchange rate. And so on, and then they realised, oh dear, well, that's not the be all and end all then, which just shows that as you've said on other streams, the checks and balances aren't in the system, and Britain as an establishment doesn't know what it's there for anymore. It's become a victim of its own kind of Ouroboros,
Right.
self-devouring narrative of bash the bad guy of the moment. Even if that causes you to sort off the leg you're standing on yourself.
Yeah, but the problem is this is scaring off people from other countries as well. You
Yeah.
have, rich Dubaians taking their money out. You have rich Chinese taking your money out. But you also got a very rich Hong Kong tycoon who owns half the properties in Hong Kong. He's got a lot of investments in UK. He's also taking all his money out as well. He's causing a huge shock to the system because people know that your money is not safe in UK anymore at any
Yeah.
point. If there
But
is any geopolitical events,
to sound a
UK
note of
can.
caution, though, if our aim is not it's derided as splendid isolation, but if we say positive old-fashioned neutrality and no non-entanglement, then most of the countries that have had that course, pursued that course historically, including the US at many times, have said
Mm,
foreign passport holders cannot buy land or houses. That was the norm rather than the exception in the world until recently. Britain has been very laissez-faire on that front, and there's possibly a risk that we are too uncritical about foreign tycoons if we say this, because the Arab and more latterly Russian and Hong Kong investment in our housing stock is one of the, I think, proximate causes for the
mm,
unaffordability of housing now.
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Buy to invest.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you drive through Embankment at night and you see properties along the other side of the embankment, and you see properties along the new power station they've built. They've completely redeveloped that area. But you drive along at night, you will see one or two lights on, and that's it.
Mm.
And when you go to the stage, and they're all sold, and obviously you know that there's a lot of foreign influence. A lot of foreigners who have bought the properties. Nobody's living in there, but they just bought it just for money
It's because,
laundering or
yeah,
investments.
Britain supposedly, well, the cover story was Britain has a good rule of law. But to hear that questioned, you should go to our series A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution and listen to the most recent episode. That's found by going to ukcolumn.org and then finding series. But that aside, the real reason was that Britain was very laissez-faire, able to turn a blind eye to questionable foreign funds in Britain, and wouldn't say overnight, you belong to the losing faction in your home regime and we're going to confiscate your funds. We didn't do that. We're starting to do it now. And that's why the Eurasian squillionaires are starting to get cold feet. But other than that, they thought, well, my well or ill-gotten gains from my own country, I can just park in London. And that having an asset there, I might be able to sell it at a great profit, but at least it's a way to park the asset.
That's right. I mean, Alex, when I was 20 years ago, when I first got into the IT sector and Oracle, there was thousands of jobs available. Right now, when I look at JobServe, I don't see anything, hardly anything at all. And it seems like London as a financial center is dying because you obviously have Brexit and you have a lot of financial institutions moving to Europe. There was a big delay because of the COVID and a lot of people working from home. But I think now banks are pushing their employees to move to Europe. I used to work for a company called EMA, who's moved to Netherlands, and every single week I'm hearing about companies moving there. Then you also hear about the insurance sector. Insurance sector is supposed to be London's main moneymaker, and obviously, and now they're talking about putting price caps on Russian ships. They're not going to insure them, and then you hear about Chinese insurance companies moving up. Russian insurance companies are moving up in the world. There's a huge insurance market in Dubai as well.
Because if the oil tanker run to Western Europe and North America is no longer where the money is because of sanctions, then the insurance for those safe and predictable tanker runs is not going to be the money spinner it was. And that's London and ultimately Zurich, Milan, Munich, Venice, isn't it? That's where the big reinsurance goes on. That maybe at that level they'll survive, but the Lloyd's of London types won't, because the big money in insurance will be insuring Gulf tankers, Russian and Chinese ships to go wherever the oil is being delivered, which will be the south and east of the world, won't it? Not the north and the west.
That's right, and I can see the insurance market in London, which was our strength, is completely disappearing. The financial market is completely dead. You walk around bank during the day, compared to what it was like 20 years ago, it was absolutely packed full of men in suits. Nowadays, you hardly
You couldn't
see
get into the
anyone.
Dockland Light Railway, couldn't you,
That's
in the
right.
morning?
Yeah, nowadays you can't hardly see anyone, and it's an absolute shame, really. And obviously, Brexit has had a big cause. But now, once we lose the insurance market, what do we have as a financial sector? And also, we're kicking out all the Russians. This used to be a very good market for money laundering as well, for a lot of oligarchs using their money to launder. Even that's been closed off now. Do you see anything good coming out of the British Financial Institute? Are we dying a slow death?
I cannot see the British financial industry remaining a world leader. I don't think the intellectual fervour is there. I don't think the moral integrity is there. I think we're into 3 or 4 generations now of men. I know it's been opened up to women and different ethnicities in the last generation, but if I think back to the work placement, work experience schemes that posh schools like mine had to try to get you a foot in the door in the city, the kind of the smirking that went on and the banter that was exchanged was of the lines of, okay, chaps, everyone here is the grandson of somebody who made a killing in the 1930s, and we're just hanging on to their reputation.
That's right, and I used to work for a bank as well at the time. And after we finish our work days, we used to go to the local pub, have a few pints, and everyone was just throwing money like it's paper. But now, after work, if you go to a pub, you don't, people people have 1 pint or two, and that's it. They go
Well,
home. It's not like it
can
was
even the
before.
Hooray Henrys? I know they never could afford to live in the West End. That was always clubland and international Playboy set. But can they even afford to live in the nicer inner London boroughs anymore? I don't think they can.
No,
I think they're
no.
being priced out to south of the river, East End, wherever else. The
That's
whole
right.
of
I think
nicer inner city London is just foreigners now.
yeah, gentrification is completely destroyed London. I mean, to buy a property now, you need a partner. You both need to have a good job, and you both need to get 30, 35-year mortgages, and that is for an average house,
Yeah.
not even in central London or anywhere posh. That is an average house in East London, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Completely have priced out. Now you have the interest rates rising, which means they will have to pay extra £400 or £500 a month. Interest rates and they will keep rising. And financial analysts have told me that for you to combat inflation, you got to increase your interest rates to the same level as inflation. So we are looking for interest rates to go up much, much higher compared to what it is now, and people will be completely losing their homes. There'll be obviously you've got the electricity bills as well, and even though there is a price cap of £2,500 to households, there are articles around that this price cap is going to finish by next April
And
because of the
suddenly your
high.
bill will triple overnight,
Yeah,
won't it?
that's right. And because this price cap is based on the gas prices staying as they are, already with the gas prices rising, they
Mm.
will the whole budget will run out by next April when people's bills will triple. And at that point is going to be a huge tipping point. You have the inflation going up as well. So the cost of living's going up. You have um, there's going to come a point when people can't afford to do anything. They can't afford to live. They can't afford to rent. They can't afford to eat or sleep or keep warm. What do you think will happen
Yeah.
then?
Well, I mean, it's a pan-Western world problem, particularly acute in Britain and Northern and Western European countries. I have a very careful household manager in the form of my Dutch wife. Dutch women are famously good with money, and she's not in despair, but she did say to me around the dining table the other day, I have saved everything we can save. I've made all the rationalizations we can, and we're still being hit with these bills. She says, I go and get your meat for the week from the cheapest and best there is, which is the local market stall, the butcher, and it's €35 just for a reasonable portion of meat a couple of times a week. So it's hard. We can cope, but there are many who can't, and anyone who thinks they can cope can suddenly find overnight they can't, due to a
Sure,
change in their health or financial circumstances, or through political persecution.
sure.
So I can't offer any easier solutions because we don't have any good men and women left in the system who can right it overnight. They don't have a vision of what Britain should be doing. If we can get rid of the financial and particularly the high banking and insurance domination of our economy overnight, which has brought so much wretchedness to Britain because there's been so much unspeakable sexual filth and deviance attached to it, and so much vision casting for Britain being a node of a satanic world empire, that I'd be glad to see the back of it overnight, and the control they exert over local politics in so many insidious ways that UK columns reporting on for so many years. But what would replace it?
That's right. That's right.
Do you want to be living it's probably best for you morally and in other ways that we can achieve some kind of rebalance of our economy in which we live basic 1940s lives. It's not a nice thought to many people these days, particularly not the baby boomers who remember the tail end of it and what it was like. But that's the sobering, not the short, sharp shock, but the long, sobering shock I think we need.
Yeah, I'm not just even worried about the people, the businesses itself as well. I mean, 5%, and I think that's just going to take companies off
Mm-hmm.
the just off on into bankruptcy really, because you have obviously companies who are paying a high cost because of electricity, gas. You have obviously now the corporation tax. You have the high interest. And a lot of these businesses have been getting away with 0% interest over the years, over the last 8 to 10 years or so.
That's
Very
right.
low interest rates. So they've been borrowing like crazy. So now they've increased the interest rates, and suddenly companies are realizing, oh crap, we have to
We were
interest payments.
borrowing money that we didn't have
That's
to
right,
spend on things
yeah.
that we shouldn't have been spending on. But to use the more Misesian term, the price signals were not reaching us. And that's why tycoons were building. And in Ireland and China, it was in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't even in existing centres where there were jobs, but building these huge rafts of houses. And this would never have been done if the cost of borrowing had been actually at proper rates. And by proper, I mean real world.
That's right. I mean, I go around talk to a lot of business owners. I kind of do that just for the channel and also for my knowledge. And everybody I speak to, I mean, for example, I speak to a coffee shop that I go to locally, and I saw some for sale signs above the coffee shop, and I say, "What's going on?" And I say, "Oh, I'm forced to sell because my electricity bills have
Mm.
almost gone up by 10 times. 10 times they've gone up." And he showed me the bill. His imports of coffee, where he brings it from Colombia and places like that, has shot up by 6, 7 times
Mm.
because of the high cost of transport. Now he has to pay more tax, and also he's been borrowing a lot of money to kind of start up his business. Now suddenly he realizes he's got extra £400-500 to pay, and he just doesn't have that kind of money. And that is just one business. I can imagine huge organizations who are in the same boat, but we're talking about borrowed billions, and imagine how much they would have to kind of pay back as well. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. Then you got the bond prices. Well, the bond prices, nobody wants to buy British bonds anymore because they know the British pound is falling. The economy is absolute trash at the moment. The yield prices are going through the roof,
Mm-hmm.
and the Bank of England had to come in, and they obviously spent 65 billion to try and buy their own bonds. And then you have Andrew Bailey saying, "Oh, we're not going to buy these bonds anymore. We're done." And it's like a two-way street. The Bank of
Mm.
England's fighting with the government's policies, and it's Monday now, and I was looking at the stocks, and the pound is still falling. The
Mm-hmm.
bank yield prices, bond yield prices, is still rising. So, there is no hope really. I mean, I don't know who can come in. I mean, Rishi Sunak is still a man. He's not Superman. I don't know anyone. You can be the greatest leader in the world. I don't know anyone that can come in and stabilize this whole market and this mess. I think we're just still heading down. It doesn't really matter who comes on
Of
power,
course,
really.
of course. But there is a large element of what has been called creative destruction involved here. And that's not just a cynical phrase used by analysts. There have been elected Conservative councillors, even parliamentarians, up to the level of Eric Pickles when he was Minister for Local Communities, that have used either that phrase itself or variations thereupon. In Pickles' own case, it was, "I am an unlikely revolutionary," making fun of his own conventional and corpulent appearance. But there have been councillors who've been speaking about a period of creative destruction. You can get away with it more easily if you're falsely using the name Conservative for your party. That at this stage it's pretty obvious that it's wrecking that's going on. If you want a new economy in the interests of new overlords, then you're going to have to squash the existing one.
Sure. So let's move on to Russia now. And who do you think destroyed the Nord Stream? Because I'll tell you one thing, if it was Russia, they could have easily blown it up in the pipelines near their borders. Why
Mm.
go to the distance of blowing up these pipelines, which is bordering Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, more near Germany than Russian? It's just common sense that Russians won't do it. Then you have the Swedish who have actually come in and did their own investigations and said, "Oh, we're not going to release our findings because of national
Mm-hmm.
security."
Well, the Germans have done the
Everybody's
same, by the way.
Germans have done the same. Everyone's quiet. If it was the Russians, if they thought it was the Russians, you will see
Mm.
this article in every single paper in the West, in front page news. Russians blew up this pipeline. This is terrorism. We need to add them to the state sponsor of terrorism. But everyone's quiet about it. In Twitter, no, it doesn't even trend. So obviously, Twitter is probably, Twitter has tools to kind of keep
Mm-hmm.
some noises down. And who do you think has done it? And how do you think people do they think people are stupid? Do you think they will get away with it?
They will get away with it. It's not that people are stupid, it's that they're distracted.
Yeah.
The the country that hasn't made any big noise, even not made the noise of "we know who's responsible," hint hint, is Poland, right? And of course Denmark, in whose territorial waters the explosion happened, because Bornholm has got Danish territorial waters around it. I think it was not quite in that area where the explosion happened. But Denmark is an Atlanticist, although a go-it-alone Atlanticist. It's only very, very recently joined CSDP, the European Union's military pillar, because it wanted to be militarily and economically self-sufficient within the EU to the extent possible. But Denmark is, like the Netherlands and Norway, a fully Anglo-American style continental country. So that's maybe not so surprising. Poland has got its own fish to fry here. It's got a deeply divided establishment. It's got the Donald Tusk wing that ultimately wishes, and there are people up to National Bank chairman level in Poland saying this on the record, that wants to offer up Polish statehood to a greater Germany. And there's that kind of, I know it's eyebrow raising or eye popping to some people to hear such talk. There's that wing. And there's the Kaczynski wing. Of course, you know, one of the Kaczynskis died in the Smolensk plane crash, but that wing of the more conservative Catholic Eastern and Southern Polish rural thinking, which is, the top priority for them is to hang the Russians at all costs, right? So there's two fake. It's an odd country because patriotism is defined by either you're a so-called progressive, in which case your aim is to dissolve Poland and make it Germany, or you're a reactionary, in which case your aim is to go all out against Russia. It's an odd mess, really, and I don't think it's feasible that the Polish Navy, which is not a negligible navy, and it's always had very strong intelligence capacities as a state, undersea and more generally with signals, I don't think Poland could have been blind as to what was going on here. That's the gentlest version of what I'll suggest. More generally, more cui bono level, who would benefit? I can't think of, and I said this to the Ausschuss on Saturday, talking to the Germans, I can't see any, no matter how treasonous, any wing of the German deep state that wants Germans to shiver and die this winter. It's not really a German problem. It is in the Anglosphere. We have politicians who wouldn't mind seeing some of our people shuffle off this mortal coil. But the Germans have never really had that, the death wish among their own people to that extent. So that I don't think anyone would, in the German deep state, would think, let's blow up the pipeline that's going to rescue us from freezing this winter. Poland, however, and more particularly in its wake, Ukraine, and going back to your earlier question, why is Britain so deeply involved in it? This British-Polish-Ukraine strategic alliance, which is there, UK columns reported on it. Some of the nutters leading the neo-Nazi battalions in Kiev have talked about it. It exists. Its fellow travelers are Scandinavia and Israel. And it really does have long-term aims, which involve, really sort of early 20th century jaw-dropping stuff like removing Russia and Germany from the map, or at least cutting them down to size. That really is a kind of harebrained scheme which would make people want to do things like blow up Russian gas supplies to Germany.
That's right. And the Polish ex-minister, I believe, he recently tweeted that thank you USA.
Yeah.
And
Radek Sikorski.
That's right.
He's a wannabe Englishman. He speaks wonderful Oxonian English, and when he was a Polish foreign minister, he used to speak to the lesser nations, as the Polish establishment always think of them, the lesser nations of the Russian world, and would say, well, we'd like you to launch a war against Russia, but don't imagine we'll be there to back you up. That's his aim in life, and he represents a whole class of Poles.
That's right. And also looking further into it, and a lot of people obviously dismissed it, but if you look further into it, his wife is on the board of directors of the NED, the National Endowment of Democracy. And this shows that he had some sort of inside information, or whether maybe his wife said something about the US had got something
the
to do
NED
with it.
is the CIA at work, you understand.
That's
Britain
right.
has a small version, the Westminster Endowment for Democracy, founded, I think, either under Jim Callaghan or just under Mrs. Thatcher. But the NED is transparent. Its admitted purpose is to do things that you can't do with a CIA badge on the front of the building anymore.
That's right.
Cultural and soft power things.
And this tells me that maybe there's NED or the CIA had to do with it. The fact that he said thank you USA.
Yeah, but
and
he's a loose
and his
cannon,
wife is
or
in
he
the board
thinks
of
of himself as a
directors.
cut above. As an Anglo, he's going to think wrongly, a bit like Liz Truss thinking that she was, she joined the club and then being shocked that she was fired or forced to fall on her sword. So Sikorsky fondly imagines that any uppity Slav, even an Oxford-educated one like him, could ever be of the same rank. They can't. He manages Ukrainians and Georgians and such lesser mortals as his class thinks of them, but he himself is managed at arm's length by the Anglo-American elite. So he's shooting his mouth off there, and certainly, as with the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and Ian Davis has documented this, as have many other authors, but Davis has done it best, I think, in a piece available on ukcolumn.org about the neo-Nazi problem. Britain and America have always thought, well, we'll choose the nuttiest nutters in Poland and Ukraine and use them as our shock troops with plausible deniability. So it doesn't, it could have been a Langley scheme that always involved Poles and Ukrainians at the sharp end of it.
That's right. I mean, there's a lot of clips circulating that Biden has said that we will shut it down one way or other. But it's not really a case of saying, he didn't say he's going to blow up the pipes. He could have meant that, he could have like used it in a diplomatic way. So I think people are taking that out of context. I think Biden probably meant diplomatically. I don't think he meant he would blow up the pipes. So I just don't think Biden's the administration had anything to do with that. I think they're completely probably down to the NED or the CIA, or maybe, like I said, it could be the British, Polish, and then you have Blinken as well coming out and saying, "Oh, this is a great opportunity for the US." He's not even denying it. He's not even saying how this is an absolute travesty. Whoever did this, this is terrorism. He didn't even say anything like that. He was just, saying, "Oh, this is not the kind of way somebody would behave if they had nothing to do with it." It shows that they knew about it. Maybe they actively didn't do it, but they knew. They know
that
who
I
did
think
it.
is most likely that, and this goes back to the 1930s as well, that the Poles in particular would come up with another scheme of daring do. And in those days, the French were the Poles' main handlers. Later on, it became the British and then the Americans. But the Western European entente generally would just look at these schemes and say, bon, go ahead and do it. And if you succeed, then we might acknowledge that we had a role in it.
Sure. So I just want to go back to Germany now. I mean, why are they allowing themselves to be used in this way, allowing themselves, their country, to be destroyed by not only USA but the rest of Europe, by Ursula, and you have people like Alanina Baerbock, who's actively saying that it's more important to support Ukraine than her own citizens in Germany and keeping them warm. I mean, there's clips on the internet. She's actively saying that. I mean, why are the German? Are they that stupid, or what's going on?
No, it's not
Why
stupid.
are they
There's a masochism, twisted idealism involved. There's self-loathing from the Third Reich, and there is also great material comfort. We've been talking about Britain's financial and economic decline as well as its moral decay. The Germans don't quite have it in those terms. They have a lot of Mittelstand and minor corporations where there's a huge, and as does Italy, in fact, northern Italy, where there's a huge amount of saved wealth being prudently invested by low-key tycoons, family business owners over the generations. And now many of these firms find that a daughter is the successor to the wealth, or at least to a share of it. And you can rage against me as a chauvinist if you want, but I'm afraid the painful fact of it is that the most away with the fairest kind of private wealth owner there is in the world these days is a young German woman from one of these old money families. Almost to a man or to a woman, they are convinced that they must invest in ESG, they must invest in changing the world. And this is the class that Baerbock came from, because daddy was very comfortably off and they moved out to the countryside and played at running a farm, doing up a farmhouse, which allowed her to say, I'm just a disadvantaged girl from a disadvantaged rural area, don't you know? She was a millionairess. There's a whole bunch of these people in Germany. And I'm not just getting at the women. The men with money and power are just as spineless, in fact, worse.
Yep.
But that's the thinking of the Baerbock types. Virtue signaling is a way of life to them. And why is this a particular problem with Germans, and particularly with the young women? I think because they inhabit the absolute apex of Maslow's hierarchy or pyramid of needs, if you're familiar with that.
Right. Yeah.
Salesmen and
Yep.
psychologists know about it.
Yep.
So if you get away from caveman level of where's my next meal coming from, and then you start thinking about security, and then you have, when a nation or a tribe is going through that stage, the big men dominate because they will bash the enemy that will come in and steal. They're only interested in coming and stealing your stuff once you have some stuff. So you're kind of that Bronze Age Old Testament level of, we have a crop, but how are we going to defend it against the Midianites? And then when you develop past that stage, you get to the sexual and self-expression stage, which the West's been in for so long. And right at the top of that is, well, I even have, my pick of any sexual fulfillment and identity, reimagination any day that I can choose. That's the post Second World War Western Europe levels, more than even in America, because the guns and butter argument. Europe decided that American guns would cover it, so it could spend all its money on butter. So the hedonism was even worse in, I say, northern continental Europe, Germany and Sweden, than anywhere else. So you end up with these heiress types who think, well, I can even have any kind of fulfillment and reimagination I want, but I want to go higher up in the pyramid, and I need a party that reflects my values, and that will be I must change the whole world. I must bring salvation to every creature on the planet. I'm a messiah. That's the level of derangement that Baerbock is at, and she insists, and so does a whole generation of Germans with her, the fake Greens whom she represents. I must take these people with me.
Yeah, it's not just Baerbock. You have Olaf Scholz as well, and the other gentleman as well. Can't remember his name now, but all three of them hymning from the same sheet all the time. And the Scholz is, he stands there in a press conference with Biden, and Biden's saying, "Oh, we'll find a way to shut Nord Stream 2 down," and the Scholz just stands there like a muppet, doesn't say anything, and he just takes it, and it's what a change from Angela Merkel, for example. When Angela Merkel was around, you knew that Germany was in safe hands. She used to push back against a lot of the policies from the United States and also Europe as well. And she's, famously standing up against Trump single-handedly while everyone else was backing out. You
She
felt
knew
that
what she
Germany
stood
was in
for.
safe
She
hands.
didn't have progressive in the true sense vision. She couldn't renew the German economy. But she was perhaps that small c conservatism was her very strength that Scholz absolutely doesn't have. And recently, when Her Majesty died, I saw a tribute in a Dutch newspaper given by another British expatriate. I was interviewed for that newspaper to give my thoughts, and another British lady living near me in the Netherlands was interviewed. And this British lady, strikingly, and I think now I've mulled over it, I think correctly said, Angela Merkel made more of her Christian faith and values than the Queen did. And and after some consideration, I thought, you're right there. I don't like to say positive things about Merkel, but you're right. And the Germans, more than other European nations, because of their history, but also because of their own inherent qualities, very much do look to Gründlichkeit, sincerity and depth, covered in one word by Gründlichkeit, in their leaders. They want people with, as the Victorians would have said, with bottom. And Merkel had that in every sense, from the corporeal through to the moral.
That's right. I mean, I've seen some. I've read this book about the era of cheap energy and cheap goods is over. The fact that Germany was getting away with getting cheap energy from Russia all these years, and obviously they are hugely dependent on gas from Russia, and also Germany has been very dependent on Chinese goods over the years. And now they've completely burned their bridges with Russia, and they are now looking to burn their bridges with China as well. You see some comments coming out from obviously Baerbock and the finance minister. I can't remember his name now, but they are completely anti-Chinese. They're completely. I just do not understand why German businesses are not standing up and saying, "Hang on a second, guys, you are completely destroying us. You are completely deindustrializing us."
The German establishment is multi-layered and decentralized. Even at the geographical level, it's not like London or Paris. Berlin is only a political center, and it's only a federal political center. The money and the local politics informed by various traditional consciences, Catholic and Protestant, is found in dozens, literally dozens of other mid-sized cities around Germany. That's Germany's unique strength. And each of those dozens of cities used to be the capital of a principality of its own until very late in history, until Napoleon's time, or a bit later in many cases. And ultimately Bismarck finished it all off. Right, so they're used to thinking locally. They're used to having people that represent their own values. And federalization after the Second World War hasn't been a brilliant solution for the Germans. That it was difficult and arduous enough for them to get a nation state, as it was for the Italians in the same era. And then they went into totalitarianism, as the Italians did, for slightly comparable reasons of not really knowing who they were. Arguably, this is what the Poles and Ukrainians faced after the First World War. And then again, after the fall of communism, that they had a very deep nationhood, profound cultural and civilizational nationhood, but no nation statehood, no historical model to go on. And the Germans are still quite juvenile in nation statehood. They still go in for gesture politics, and you're either cravenly pro-American or naively anti-Anglo in German politics. So it's a kind of cartoon view of the world they have, and this is expressed in their foreign policy.
That's right. And you also have obviously 70,000 US troops stationed in Germany as well. And, there's stories about when Angela Merkel was in power, her phones were being tapped. Is there some sort of control that the US government is placing Germany under? And they put all of these puppet guys like Olaf Scholz and the rest of his
the chapter
team.
and verse on that is by, I think he died a few years ago now, a major named Hans-Gerd Kormossa, who ran the Bundeswehr, so the German army's military intelligence in the 1970s and 80s, I think, end of the Cold War. Who came up with this phrase. No convincing primary documentation has been found for it, but I believe that the phrase itself is a political reality, even though it's probably only a gentleman's agreement. And the phrase is Kanzlerakte, meaning the chancellor document, not the chancellor's document, so not what the German equivalent of the prime minister has as a document, but an agreement about the chancellorship, the premiership, namely that the appointments are subject to American say-so, much as with Finlandization, where during the Cold War, the Finnish president and prime minister had to get agreement from Moscow, that they were acceptable to them. But the Kanzlerakte seems to go further, that no major decisions will be made in security, defense, foreign policy, or in some ways even corporate economy level, without ensuring that the Western allies, and particularly Washington, are happy with it.
Sure, and there's people on the chat saying that Olaf Scholz is going to China. It does seem like Olaf Scholz is starting to wake up and realizing there's fire all around him. Maybe he's going to China for some damage control. I don't think anything can be agreed, but there's German companies like BASF who produce fertilizer and other things that the world needs is moving its factories to China. They've recently built a new factory for cost them like 9 billion, and they're shutting down the factories in Europe. But there's also some German companies moving to the United States. As a business person,
very humiliating, but they can afford the energy there.
That's right. I mean, as a business person, even though energy is cheap in the United States, the rent, the cost of making goods is not. I mean, labor,
and frankly,
for example,
the quality of the employees is not a patch on what you would have had in Germany. Although I think even there, the industriousness and the intellectual level of the workers, because these are skilled jobs, even if they're manual jobs, that's no longer what it was. I mean, this is the generation that spat an Annalena Baerbock out of German schooling, for goodness sake.
That's right. But the major German companies, we're talking about Volkswagen, BMW. I mean, BMW recently announced that they're going to move their factories from UK to China. Volkswagen is increasing its investment in China. So is Mercedes. So are the German companies as well. Nobody's talking about it. Everyone's saying that, they're all moving to the United States. But I think, business-wise, it makes sense to move to China because you have cheap energy there, cheap labor. I mean, compared to the United States, cheap
You're not going to have strikes, are you?
You're not going to have strikes. Things are made in a very good quality. You're not running the risk of geopolitical events. I mean, China is pretty much oblivious to the outside world, whatever's happening in Europe and United States. China's inflation rate has still kept down. I believe it's around 2.5% at the moment. So it makes perfect business sense to move to China. I believe that a lot of German businesses will move to China, but they're not going to announce it. They'll probably announce it like BASF has done after they've built the facilities, then announce it.
That would
Or
be the
it's we're
German
built,
way, yes.
yeah, we're
And
built in
in
now.
the
So
extension of that, AJ, is that you were saying rightly a couple of minutes ago, where's the Mittelstand or corporate Germany saying enough is enough to the chancellery or the Auswärtiges Amt. That does happen, and I think Scholz getting wind of a problem, as you said a moment ago, and going to China is an indication of that. There are a lot of solid people left in the German system. They can lobby their government through the party links, through various Stiftungen, think tank and foundations, various kinds of decentralized networks. But there is a deep layer of German old money that has for a very, very, very long time, and this, exactly a century ago, 1922, the Treaty of Rapallo, the abortive attempt to come to an agreement with Lenin over, throwing the West over during the era of the Dawes Plan. That's another example of that. There's always been German old money that has said, to hell with this, and let's run our own part of the world, run Middle Europa for ourselves. Not all of them have been wanting to exploit the Slavs, but there's been an undertone of that. But at least reach a modus vivendi with the Slavs, absolutely. And these people haven't gone away, but they're going to accrue a lot of mass and think very carefully and hedge their bets, as Germans do. So they're investing in specie now to be as safe as they can from punitive and confiscatory measures against their own finances and their own assets. But at some point they are going to spring the trap, I think, and tell the German establishment to throw the Anglos over. If it doesn't happen at federal level, it will happen in some of the states like Saxony.
yeah, exactly. And also, I feel that the Chinese do not respect Olaf Scholz. I mean, I remember the time when Olaf Scholz went to Saudi Arabia to try and secure some more oil.
Yeah, and they have the big
He,
Siemens investment in Mecca as well, don't they?
yeah, and
The
he
clock
wasn't
and
even
other things.
greeted in the airport. I was looking at the Saudi papers. He didn't even make the front page.
Yeah.
They hardly mentioned it. Nobody in the European side, nobody even mentioned it. He obviously came back empty-handed. And I believe that the Germans actually there is an embargo in place with the Saudis, and they said that they're not allowed to sell the Saudis any weapons for a long time. And Olaf Scholz went to Saudi to release the embargo, and I believe he went there to talk about human rights and stuff. And when you start talking human rights with the Saudis, the first thing they'll do is show you the door. It's like, get out.
Of course,
We don't want to hear it.
of
And
course.
he came back to Germany. He released the embargo, but he got nothing in return. And he just shows how weak he is as a leader. You give something to someone and you get nothing back in return. Again, I feel that the Chinese used to respect Merkel a lot. She had a good relationship with the Chinese and the Russians, but I feel that Olaf Scholz is a bit of like damp squid in the world. Nobody really
If
respects him because
if
they know
Merkel
he's
hadn't
such.
put her foot down, Georgia and the Ukraine would have joined NATO in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. I have to give that to her.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, she was the reason why Russia did not go through with the Crimean War. I mean, they were planning on doing what they are now during 2014, and she went in and obviously agreed to the Minsk agreement, helped agree to it. But obviously, what's happened since then is a complete tragedy. Everyone just put it to one side and say, "Oh, don't worry, Russians are not going to do anything. Let let them be." Why do you think that the Minsk agreements was not implemented by Ukraine's or the rest of the West? Is it because they feel Russia was weak and they're just trying to humiliate them,
Well,
or
there is the
is there?
slightly telling statement of Dmytro Yarosh, one of the biggest neo-Nazi commanders in the country, that when Zelensky had been completely newly elected in summer 2019, quote, if he implements one part of the Minsk agreement, he'll be swinging from a tree on Khreshchatyk, the main shopping street in Kiev. That's a slight indication of why not. In the end, just before the 2022 war, Kiev was claiming, without using the very phrase itself, but was invoking the provision of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, 1969, that it had signed the Minsk Accords under duress. That it had at least a moral, if not an international law, get-out clause, not to allow for a referendum to be held in Donetsk and Lugansk. But Merkel could, I think, I'm sure she could see through that, because she lost
Yeah.
faith in the Georgians. Not that she ever really had any, but in the same way, you could see that if she had still been chancellor during the 2022 war,
Mm.
she wouldn't have been backing Zelensky to the hilt for this very reason.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So talking about Zelensky, how long do you think he's got left? Because let's put it this way. I mean, this cost of war is costing Ukraine a lot. Russia is obviously making money through selling oil and gas, so they can afford it at this stage. And the sanctions haven't not really worked against Russia. The sanctions have actually boomeranged against the West. But
There's been a
Russia,
self-selection. The Russians, including a lot of people in your industry, IT, who thought, no, I
mm,
can't imagine life without PayPal and the dollar, they've gone to the CIS countries. And
yep,
some of them, like Armenia, have said, we won't take any more Russian IT people here. Otherwise, you'll just choke our own economy. So the very opposite problem to what Britain has right now.
yeah, and that's right.
But that pressure valve has been, that spigot's
Mm,
been turned. And so everyone, not everyone, I can't be so categorical, but in blanket terms, those who are in Russia and plugging away at their jobs now they're not happy with the war by any means, but the
mm.
active dissidents are not really a factor anymore.
Yeah, so let's talk about these sanctions. I don't understand. You have a room full of Western leaders who are all standing up and putting their hands up, saying, "Oh, I'm going to sanction Russia
Mm.
doing this. I'm going to sanction Russia doing that." They all like having this competition each other who's going to
Mm.
sanction Russia the most, and they're frothing in their mouths, thinking, "Yeah, we're going to destroy the ruble. We're going to destroy the Russian economy." You have Ursula coming up and saying, "We are in the process of destroying Russian economy." Biden has said the same thing. None of that's happened. In fact, these sanctions have completely turned around and hit them. Didn't anyone in that room say, "Hang on a second, what about China and India?" Because this is exactly what Russia is doing now. They're building pipelines to China. They're going to replace all of that
Yeah, and
gas they're
railways.
selling. Yeah, and gas they're selling to Europe into China. They're going to obviously build pipelines going to India as well. India's buying their oil. China's buying their oil.
India and
Russia is
China
not.
can use the Russian Arctic coast now to
That's right.
export their
And
goods.
people are forgetting about the population of China and India. You got 1.4 billion in
Mm.
China, 1.4, 1.5 billion in India. I believe next year India is going to be the most populous country in the world. And all of these people will need energy. They will need, they'll need to keep warm. They'll need energy. So what is the West this short-sighted? I mean, I just don't
Yes,
understand why they
yes,
think these sanctions would have completely. I mean, if they got the whole world involved, if they got the Chinese and the Indians on their side, then yeah, the sanctions would have worked. The Russian economy would have collapsed. Did they not think about the global South or the Chinese or Indians? Are they
no.
that short-sighted?
It is impossible to get the current crop of people who govern Britain, and more generally the West, but especially Britain, to conceive of the global South as being on a footing with us, on a par with us, let alone, as you were hinting earlier, with the Indians having more money and more sense than us. That's impossible for them to countenance. So they certainly can't think about Johnny Foreigner 1 and Johnny Foreigner 2, namely the Russians and the Chinese, getting their act together. A few geostrategists do and issue alarming papers about it, but the sanctions are decided on by the banking level, and they just don't think in those terms at all. They think, well, it all runs through the City of London and Manhattan, doesn't it? But it doesn't. It doesn't even run through the US dollar
Nope,
anymore.
nope.
Not even through foreign parks dollars that are their own dollar pools, the euro dollar and the petrodollar. No, it doesn't all run through that anymore.
That's right. It's almost like they've dismissed the friendship between Russia and China. Obviously, they've had border issues in the past, and the West has completely underestimated the friendship
Yeah.
between China and Russia. And look at
And
this.
China and India. This is the big
And
one. I'm
that's
going to
right.
try to
Yeah,
do some big interviews on this. I can't promise a timescale or anything, but we are looking to do big geopolitical interviews with Indians and Chinese and Russians on this issue.
that's right. Yeah. And then you get this, Alex. Listen to this. I mean, the Chinese had the Beijing Olympics
Mm.
in January, February time, and all of their friends arrived in the Olympics. The West completely humiliated them by boycotting the Olympics. You had the United States, UK, pretty much the rest of Europe boycotted the Olympics as well. And Russia came in, Putin came in, he stayed for a few days, worked out a few deals with President Xi, worked out a new gas pipeline, and he kind of cemented their relationship. And then you have the West who have the gall to tell China, oh, you need to side with us, not the Russians.
Mm.
Why would the Chinese side with you guys who have completely boycotted the Olympics? I mean, these Olympics were a big deal for China. For you to boycott them is absolutely humiliating. And then you have obviously the US and the UK are antagonizing them further by sending ships to the Taiwanese Strait, and you have the Pelosi incident as well. Why would the Chinese backstab their friend Russian? And the Russian and Chinese is a match made in heaven. You know, Russia has all the raw materials that China needs, and China produces all of the materials that the world needs, produces the goods. And you know, if there was ever a boycott against Chinese, if there was any like a war on the Taiwanese Strait and the whole world decides to boycott China and decide to not, sanction China, China can still get all the raw materials it needs from Russia. It can get all the gas it needs. It can get all the
Mm.
oil it needs. It can get it from Iran even, and China will still make these raw materials. They have access to 90% of the raw materials, rare earth minerals and stuff. So, so, so why did the intelligence community not realize this or think about this or see this happening? I mean, what is wrong with British intelligence, US intelligence? I mean, what's going on here?
They don't determine policy. Their assessments go up to the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee. Ministers read them, but ministers have their red boxes of intelligence open on their desks when they make their decisions, and they also have, maybe not even in documentary form on their desks, but certainly in their heads, they have the requirements of their donors and the city banks and the cabinet office committees who represent the interests of those banks. All of that is buzzing in their ears as they make their decisions as well. Intelligence is at best only meant to be a supportive tool to elected decision makers anyway.
Yeah, it's just beggars beyond my sense how they underestimated the friendship between Russia and China. I mean, even
Well, that's, marriage made in heaven, as you said. Well, that was said about the Russo-German friendship a century ago, with Germany playing the role that China now does. So that's part of the answer, maybe, as to why German business is going to China, is that it sees China as its new self, with Russia playing the same role as before, possibly. But Russia is also now a high-brain, high-value-added economy, and leapfrogging the West in fields that it never performed well in, like agriculture. So there's high-value agriculture, export food.
Yep.
So there is that. Culturally and at a visceral level, I think the friendship or the match made in heaven is only from the Chinese side. If you look at the early negotiations, 17th, 18th centuries between the Chinese and Russian empires, there was a lot of suspicion, particularly Sinophobia from the Russian side. And that went on through the Soviet era. The Sino-Soviet split was not just all about the West splitting the powers or the Chinese having a more mind control version of communism. It was also about genuine fear of a yellow peril on the Russians' part. And I think in the end, Russia and indeed India and Japan will probably act in concert with or without the increasingly puny powers of the Five Eyes, navies and intelligence. They will act to contain China, even if they're in a strategic alliance with them.
Sure. You mentioned Japan. I feel that they are cannon fodder in any future war against China in the Taiwanese Strait. I mean, Japan, with its past, Japan has caused a lot of atrocities in China in the past, and there is no love between them. And so far, Japan has been obviously pacifist, but things are changing. They're making moves. They are saying certain
Britain
things.
is transferring a lot of the exotic military technology straight to Japan, or the Japanese, of course, as usual. Since the end of the Meiji Restoration, they only need a very short suggestion of what to do, and they soon do it better than the West. But they usually need an injection of an idea first before they exceed the West. They seem to have de facto not carriers, that would be completely banned as with the Germans, but they seem to have some kind of concept of helicopter gunships that may be de facto nuclear armed. And their thinking is always, as Britain's was during the 20th century, that not only these Johnny-come-latelys, the Germans, they wouldn't be able to build a navy rivaling Britain's, but even there was a very strong aspect of snobbery during the Second World War, that supposedly the Americans wouldn't manage to build a carrier fleet because they just weren't that kind of seafaring nation, conveniently ignoring all the heroism of the Revolutionary War at sea, the 1812 War, the US Civil War, which all had, heroic seamanship and strong feedback loops that American sailors soon worked out how to crew a ship better and build it more quickly and robustly. There was still this arrogance that, the American carriers don't even have metal decks, so kamikaze will smash through them. That attitude seems to be prevalent in Japan from what little I can see of the matter. This attitude that the Chinese will never be a great seafaring power because in their history they're always afraid of the sea and banned people, apart from in Zhang He's time, from going to sea. Right? That's a dangerous assumption to make. You now have money and patriotism and potentially tens of millions of able-bodied men who could go to sea if China wanted to. And I would never rule out that they could build a navy that could flatten the Japs, even if the Japs at this moment think our role is to be some kind of heaven-sent outer guard of the China Sea and to hem them in.
Yeah, you look at South Korea as well. You obviously have 40,000 US troops stationed in South Korea. You have 50,000 in Japan. You have a huge number in Australia. And I feel that these three would be used as cannon fodder in any future war. The United States will use them as bases
Yes.
to
And
send
frankly, I
attacks
doubt
to.
the quality of the Korean soldier and seaman and airman in such a conflict. I think that they've been got at. Their resolve to fight is not at all what it used to be. They're worse than Western Europe and the blue states of America now for sexual ideology and materialism. It's a completely lost society, South Korea.
Yeah, and I think it goes deeper because American lives are very precious to America. And this goes back to the Korean War and Vietnam War, where body bags were coming home in the United States, and people were standing up and demonstrating, and there was a change of government, and then obviously you had Nixon coming in and pulling troops out. So it's a very, very big deal about losing American lives. You can see in Iraq a war as well, how
It was
careful
during
they
the
were.
Iraq War, during the surge, that bodies were flown back to, I forget which fort it was near Washington, D.C., where they used to be flown to, but the order was given to fly them to another one and to make it a federal criminal offense to photograph
That's
the
right.
coffins coming
Yeah,
off. I told some
that's
American counterparts this while I was still at GCHQ, and the NSA guys and military guys I spoke to said, no, that we didn't use the term fake news in the noughties, but that's what they told me it was, just as a knee jerk. No, we wouldn't
That's
ban
right.
that in
Yeah,
America.
yeah. And it seems like they've have basically come up with this new doctrine where they fight wars, but they use other countries' troops. And so, a prime example is obviously Ukraine. They're going to fight Russia with every
Yeah.
single last
And
Ukrainian.
Britain will teach them how to do it because Britain's
That's
been
right.
doing it a lot
Yeah.
more successfully and a lot longer.
And if there's a war over Taiwan, they'll use every single last person in Taiwan, and they'll use those military bases in South Korea, Japan. They'll use them as cannon fodder as well. They use Australia as well. It seems like Americans would be fighting from a distance while using these countries as cannon fodder, and that is what they are doing recently. And it seems, how can nobody else see it? How can these countries not see
They
it? I'm talking
can.
about Ukraine, Taiwan. They're just completely being used.
Well, yeah. I think that the BBC mind control is so strong that within the space of 4 or 5 years in some of these countries, Georgia is another example, those who used to be cynical and realistic about their own nation's sins and shortcomings and realistic about the need for a rapprochement with Russia, a modus vivendi with Russia, suddenly, without realizing what switches had been flipped in their own heads, were saying, our country must stand on the front lines and defeat this Putinism, even if we all die in the process. And you Westerners, you have no right to live in peace at home. You must come and die with us. That happened overnight in these countries. And it was largely British soft power that did it. It went native within the younger generation of journalists and think tank people in those countries. So that's a large part of how it happens.
Sure. I think the Chinese also have a very, very big bone to pick with the British. I mean, I'm talking about the time when British marched into the Summer Palace and
Yes.
completely destroyed it, burnt it to the ground, stole over 1.5 million um, antiques and items and destroyed the rest. And obviously the Chinese never forget that. It's part of their 100-year humiliation. And I'm
Hmm.
pretty sure that if the British get involved in the Taiwanese Strait in any form whatsoever, there is a lot of pain to come. Oh, it's
Can you
just,
see them
just look.
marching up to Windsor and making off with all the portraits?
Yeah, probably. But look at the Chinese Navy. I mean, they are turning into a blue water navy, and you have the Arctic route, which is a direct route straight from China into the UK. And
Yeah.
in the next 20, 30 years, when they build 2 or 3 more carriers, they build a huge fleet which can protect those carriers, and Britain starts getting involved in wars they
Yeah.
shouldn't be getting involved. I
We
mean,
would need
Taiwan is
all
minding
of,
their
of Uncle
business.
Sam's submarines to have any
Mm,
chance of closing the Greenland gap. And we're not going to have them at our disposal. And we're getting to the stage now where not only are our submarines old rust buckets, HMS Vanguard, the oldest in the
yep.
current nuclear boat class, has been in dock for 2 years and counting now. But even the American ones, they're not rust buckets, but they're famously iron discipline of the US submarine fleet, nuclear and conventional, does seem to be giving way in the way that the British Navy's discipline in submarines has for some years, so that you've got people who, as soon as they come ashore, have fisticuffs with each other. There seems to be, as with trawler fleets, an unwritten rule that you don't fight at sea because your lives depend on each other. But as soon as they step on the quayside, they start smashing each other's jaws. There's been several incidents of this,
That's right. And
when they
I'm
put
also
into port
hearing
in Okinawa or wherever.
yeah, sorry. I'm also hearing the British carrier out of action as well. It's been
Yeah.
moored in one of these ports in UK. It's
Yes.
completely
Yes.
broken down. Um, a- and now they've announced that they're going to have to cut the defense budget recently as
Mm.
well. I believe they announced that
Ben Wallace
yesterday.
threatened to resign if there was any cuts to his budget, and it
That's
wasn't
right.
so that the realm could be defended, but it was so that there should be no need for any lessening of the efforts in Ukraine.
Right.
That's our
I mean, Liz
priority.
Truss was talking about increasing the defense budget to 3% of the GDP, but obviously that didn't happen. But now they're asking for the defense budget to be reduced. And I, I cannot see, by reducing the budget, I mean, you have to look at the inflation, and the cost of making any military goods is so much more expensive now than it was like 2 years ago, for example. Reducing the budget, we're not talking about few million here and there. We're talking about billions,
Yes,
and the
and
cost
we're
of.
talking about a high-end engineering
Yep.
sector that, because the bulk isn't there, the production of many cars, for example, that you cannot scale up quickly and
Mm,
give the best brains and the best mechanics and engineers the exciting challenges of a new generation of whatever it may be, torpedo or drone. No, that can't come out of nowhere. It has to come out of an existing backbone
yep.
of civil engineering.
Yeah, I remember in the Second World War, and Britain had a very good industrial factory then, and all of their factories had turned into military installations. They were churning out tanks
Yes,
and planes and rockets and
as the
things like that.
Americans famously did on the West Coast in particular, thumbing
That's
their
right.
noses at
Yeah.
this British arrogance. They proved perfectly able to knock out high class boats and
Yeah.
ships, and this is what
Yeah.
the Chinese will be doing by now, I think.
That's right. And it seems like the tables have turned. Now the Chinese, they've got a huge factory base in China. They are the factory of the world. They can and this is a state-run country. Most of the
Mm.
companies are state-run, and they can easily just convert those factories into, rocket making or ship making, plane making industries. And
There's still the question of how much of their technology ultimately is Western high-end technology that was pilfered by Israeli allies and sent
mm,
to China. That's one of the undisclosed main vectors of the last few decades, I think. So
yeah,
there is a question of, particularly with the airframes, which famously the more electronic they get, the more liable they are to drop out of the sky when anything goes wrong with a single wire. So there's a question that if they are knocking off F-35s or equivalents in other branches, will these things fall out of the sky on the first day of World War III? It would be dangerous to assume that that's the
Sure.
case, but
Yeah,
it's a possibility.
you're right. And people forget that we were involved quite heavily in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and we were there side by side with the United States. We had a major army there for 20 or so years in Afghanistan, and same in Iraq as well for about 10 years. And now you have Ukraine. Britain is giving away weapons to Ukraine. Do we have anything left? Because I don't know if we have anything left. We've been like, destroying it over the years, over the
Mm,
year, you know, decades of wars with the Middle East and Ukraine. And you have Ben Wallace coming out saying, "Oh, we've got no more of these shoulder launched weapons left to give to
mm.
Ukraine, and
No more man pads. Yeah,
no more man pads." And it beggars belief how they're going to replace all of that. I mean, you need money and you need time. I mean, the M1 motorway, they've been working on that for over 20 years. I've been driving
yeah,
up and down the
yeah.
M1. These roadworks are never ending. They're always happening. And this just shows the slow rate of progress in UK. I mean, things just don't get done. And why is Britain getting involved in all these? I mean, now they want to try and get involved with Taiwan. Obviously, when Liz Truss was there, she was talking about sending a delegation to Taiwan. She was thinking of putting China as a threat, the same threat level as Russia. I mean, you're talking about a small fish in the pond, picking fight with a big, a big
Yes, but they
dragon.
don't see themselves as a small fish. You
Yeah,
know, they don't really care if Britain sinks, as long as their hegemony
yep, yep,
continues. That's the long and the short of it. And they have now successfully embedded themselves
sure.
in other cultures. Frontline states around Russia, China, and Iran have been co-opted into thinking of themselves as little Britons.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time now. I think we should try and put it to the end. Really appreciate your time, Alex. Do you have
Thank
anything
you.
more to say, or any other
We could
last
go off
words?
on many tangents from here, AJ, but just
Sure,
to
sure.
encourage you mightily, because I am seriously impressed by your breadth and depth of thinking. And I'm very glad to see that somebody, even now working in the British civil service, has a mind of his own and isn't afraid, clearly, to have conversations at work with colleagues. And there may be more civil servants of the younger
Yeah,
generation listening. Not trying to be
yeah,
patronising to you, but you're clearly of the younger generation, slightly
yep,
younger than me. Just to say, don't be afraid
yep.
of raising these issues with your own superiors and colleagues. Don't be afraid, if you're more at the sharp end of the
Mm,
foreign policy establishment, don't be afraid to say, Chatham House, why on earth are we doing anything that Chatham House tells us? It's private.
yeah.
You know,
Um,
what about the coronation oath? What about
yep.
ministerial probity? Just ask the question and see them scuttle.
Yeah. No, Alex, I got to be honest with you. Everybody I speak to, all of my colleagues, everybody is pretty much in agreement. Privately,
Mm,
they are they all have the same mentality as me. They all have the same agreement in terms of
yeah,
how we're dealing with the world geopolitics. But publicly, they're not going to say anything. They'll keep quiet. And I think this is
yeah.
one of the reasons uh, I had this. I'm using this platform to kind of speak out. I mean,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, I was scared coming forward. All these years, I thought, well, I'm civil service. I might get into trouble. Why not? But then I thought about it. I thought, these stuff need to be said. I really need to make an awareness of what's going on around the world. And yeah, I mean, privately, everybody's in agreement behind,
mm.
the back. A lot of civil servants are absolutely shocked by what's going on. Um, but yeah, I think publicly, not many will speak out because you are kind of the eyes are watching, as they say.
Can
You've
I
got to be
just
careful.
gently but firmly encourage such people? You saw what happened in the NHS with
Yep,
COVID, didn't you? And you
yep,
see so many people have on their consciences for the rest of their lives the thinking that I was complicit in murder, right? And you,
mm,
if you're in the foreign and defence policy establishment to any degree, if you don't say what your conscience tells you to say, you may be reproaching yourself in not very many years hence that you're complicit in murder.
that's right. Yeah, I mean, COVID is suddenly disappeared now, and now we've moved on to the next big thing, which is Ukraine. nobody even mentions COVID. Nobody's walking around with a mask.
No.
2 years ago, they were saying, "Oh, you need to wear a mask. You need to get you're vaccinated. If you don't, you're gonna lose your job."
Hmm.
You know, and now they have completely forgotten about all that. All these people that got charged for breaking lockdown rules, I'm hearing that they are now dropping those charges as
Yes.
well. So it's a complete 180, and these uh, yeah, it's completely 180 now, and I'm just feeling, you know, now they've moved on to Ukraine. Obviously, now on the every front page you see Ukraine. Nobody's mentions anything about the COVID. Nobody's talking about the long COVID
Mm.
illnesses, and nobody's talking about these excess deaths that are happening
Hmm.
right now. And this is due to
Except Public Health Scotland, which in the last couple of days, as exclusively reported by the Herald, has said, we've decided not to investigate because it would stop mothers getting jabbed.
that's right, yeah, and there's a huge amount of excess deaths. I mean, Uh, my uncle actually passed away because he couldn't be seen. He got cancer and he couldn't be seen in the NHS
Mm.
because of all of these COVID rules and the waiting list moved to like 2 years. I mean, 2 years is some of these waiting lists moved to, and because he couldn't be seen in 2 years, his cancer got
Mm.
to him and he passed away. And apparently, there's 40,000 excess deaths. Uh, they're kind of brushing under the table because they cannot say that this was due to um, not being seen over the past few years or because of the waiting list because of COVID. I mean, it's all related. I mean, people will look at what deaths are caused by COVID, but they don't look at what excess deaths are caused by, you know, by these COVID policies
It's not
itself.
a badge of honour, but at UK Column, I think we were the first to say this in terms when we came out very early on in 2020 with a headline, Lockdown Deaths, Not COVID Deaths.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think we should maybe talk about that in a separate conversation. I think it's a long conversation. So we'll try and leave
Gladly.
it there. Will you come in again and have a further chat with us about the world
Yes,
and
yes.
stuff?
I can't always promise availability, but I would like to carry this on. And if it's to be COVID, maybe Debbie Evans, if she's available, would be an
Sure.
excellent guest for you to have.
Yeah, you've been a great guest, Alex. I really
Well, thank
appreciate your
you.
time.
Thank you,
Yeah,
AJ.
I've really learned a lot from you being here. But yeah, please, yeah, I'd love to invite you again, maybe in the
You
next
see,
few
you're
weeks.
actually you're genuinely doing this to learn as well, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah.
if you'll allow me to use the word sweet, it's rare that you're not setting up this channel to opine.
No,
You're actually
no,
wanting to
obviously,
learn.
that's right. I do learn from not only people like yourself, but also from the viewers as well. I mean, yeah, it's a great, yeah. I think everyone has duty to learn. I mean, a couple of
Yes.
years ago, I was completely oblivious to what was happening around the world. I used to believe in the BBC. I used to believe
Hmm.
in what the media used to tell me. And then I woke up one day and I thought, you know, as a human being, you have you need to go out and do your own research. You have your
Yes.
own mind.
Yeah.
You cannot be spoon fed this
I mean, it's not the
BS that
French civil service. It's not supposed to be you are grade 10, you are not paid to think. The British civil service is supposed to be about think and tell us where we're going wrong.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And I feel that UK has been very much dumbed down over the years. And I look around people and I look around. People have been fed a lot of reality TV shows, for example. Like I'm talking about Love Island. I'm talking about people are fed social media. People are made to be dumbed down in UK, and this
Mm.
has been happening for the past 10, 20 years. I mean, I remember when I was much younger, people used to have intelligent conversations with them. They used to know a lot about the world that was happening. You had 2 million people marching against the Iraq war, for example, but you don't see any of that right now because
Mm.
people are completely dumbed down to what's happening around the world. And I think I was in the train the other day and somebody was watching Love Island Australia or something like that. And I was thinking, come on, man.
Yeah.
Don't you have something better to do with your time? I think people are just so dumbed down nowadays, and it's a shame, really, because we are supposed to be, as humans, supposed to be more intelligent. We should be questioning things more about what's happening around the world. This is generally affecting everyone. You got the cost of living crisis, and you have to ask why this is happening, why the cost of living crisis is happening. You need to ask questions. You need to find out the real reasons. But nobody's doing that. Everyone's just put their head in the sand and pretending it will go away. Do you find that? Do you find people are just being dumbed down over the
Certainly,
years? And
of course, it's going on in Britain worse than anywhere else, I think. And there's an intermediate step. If you are worried about how to talk to your colleagues about your problems of conscience with policy being pursued, then the intermediate step is when people ask you around the water cooler, what do you think of the latest spat on Love Island? Just in a very calm and friendly way, say, I don't watch that nonsense. That's enough to re-engineer their thoughts of you
yeah, yeah.
to somebody that I actually have to watch what I say when I speak to because they have standards.
Mm. Yeah, that's exactly what I do say to them, actually. I said, why don't
Good.
you, spend your time more productively, read a book,
You won't
find
recall
out
it, but
what's.
there was a 1980s TV program for kids called "Why Don't You?" and they had the jingle
Mm.
at the beginning that went, "Why don't you turn off the TV set and do something more beautiful instead, or something more interesting instead?"
That's right.
Mm,
Yeah, it's not just Love Island. I'm just talking about just trash TV, just normal television, just
yeah,
Netflix even, sports. A lot of people just are armchair. Just sit in front of the TV, and that's all they want to do is watch TV and watch nonsense and filth, and it just pollutes your mind. You just get dumbed down. You don't want to think. Um, Unfortunately, that's. I think I don't know if it was something planned by the government, because I don't remember seeing this in 20 years ago. I think maybe it's a rise of social media, because 20
yeah.
years ago we didn't really have phones. We didn't have social media back then. People were talking, people were communicating, and nowadays people are on their phones 24/7, looking
Hmm.
at Instagram, looking at Twitter, looking at you know. I feel that the world is changing because of that.
It is.
And the tech companies found a way to control people using that technology, using social media. Imagine if you're on Twitter, you get hundreds of messages about Ukraine and how Russia's evil, and Ukraine is the good guys. You and as an average citizen, you would automatically think that, because you're being constantly being bombarded with that information. And this is how they kind of probably brainwash the people. And
Yeah,
even Elon Musk said that, his team did investigations in Twitter, and they found out 80-90% of the accounts were fake. They were just used as
yeah.
bots, to influence people. Certain stories they want to get out are pushed out, and certain stories which are the truth are pushed down, and that's how they control the masses. Anyway, I've taken too
Absolutely.
much of your time, Alex.
Oh,
So
don't worry,
let's
AJ.
let's catch up next time, and we'll talk more.
Yeah, may take
Thanks
a
for
couple of
everyone for
months till I have
listening.
another slot, but it's been really appreciated. And
Yeah, I
thank you so
appreciate all
much.
your time. Thanks for everyone for listening, and I'll see you guys soon. Hang on a second, Alex. I will talk backstage. So I'm just going to end the broadcast.